Hello and welcome to the Ghastly Journal. Tonight, I have a tale to share with you, one that to this day still haunts me. Draw close, dim your lights, and listen carefully to my story about an inheritance that brought into my life more than just wealth. They say family ties bind us, even beyond the grave. Until 3 months ago, I never believed that, when a letter arrived that would change everything. The day started like any other. I was sorting through my mail, bills, advertisements, the usual suspects, when an envelope with an elegant wax seal caught my eye. The return address showed a law firm I'd never heard of, Morton, Price and Associates. Inside was a letter informing me that my great-aunt, Evelyn Blackwood, whom I'd never met, had passed away and had surprisingly named me the sole beneficiary of her estate. I should mention that I barely knew my extended family. My parents were rather private people who rarely spoke about relatives, especially those from my father's side. I knew I had a great-aunt named Evelyn, but that was the extent of my knowledge. The letter explained that I was her only living relative, a fact I found odd but didn't question at the time. I had inherited Blackwood Manor, a sprawling Victorian estate nestled in the misty hills of New England, along with all its contents and a considerable sum of money. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing before massive wrought iron gates, staring up at what was now my home. Blackwood Manor was exactly what you'd expect from a century-old estate, imposing stone walls covered in ivy, tall windows that seemed to watch you as you approached, and a slate roof with ornate chimneys reaching toward the gray sky. The property was surrounded by ancient oak trees whose branches swayed even when there was no wind, their shadows dancing across the overgrown lawn. Mr. Morton, the attorney handling the estate, met me at the entrance. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual expression of mild concern. Mr. Blackwood, he greeted me, using the surname I shared with my mysterious benefactor. I trust your journey was pleasant. I nodded, still taking in the immensity of the property. The house has been vacant since your great-aunt's passing 6 months ago, he continued, producing an ancient iron key from his pocket. She was quite specific about the inheritance. Everything is to be yours with just one condition. I raised an eyebrow. There's always a catch, isn't there? The portrait in the main hall is to remain in its place of honor. That was her only stipulation. It seemed simple enough. Keep a painting hanging on a wall, hardly a burden for inheriting an entire estate. The massive oak door creaked open, revealing a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from an old money mansion, dark wood paneling, ornate moldings, crystal chandeliers, and antique furniture draped with white sheets. The air inside was stale and carried the faint scent of roses and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something older, like ancient paper and dust. Mr. Morton led me through the foyer and into what he called the main hall, a spacious room with a massive fireplace and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the back gardens. And there it was, hanging above the fireplace. The portrait. It depicted a woman in her early 30s dressed in Victorian-era clothing, a high-collared deep green dress with intricate lace details. Her posture was rigid, her expression severe. Dark hair was pulled back tightly from a pale face with high cheekbones. But it was her eyes that captivated me. Deep, almost black, and somehow knowing. They seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. That is your great-aunt Evelyn, Mr. Morton explained, his voice lowered as if we were in a church. Painted when she was about your age. She was quite adamant that the portrait remain here. I approached the painting, drawn to those piercing eyes. There was something unsettling about the way they seemed to look directly at me, as if the woman in the painting knew me. She looks young here, I commented. When did she pass away? Miss Blackwood was 93, he replied. She lived a long, albeit solitary life. This house has been in your family for generations, Mr. Blackwood. I'm sure she would be pleased to know it remains with a Blackwood. After showing me through the rest of the house, over 20 rooms, most of them unused for decades, and explaining the financial aspects of my inheritance, Mr. Morton handed me a thick envelope. Miss Blackwood left this for you. Her personal letter. He checked his watch. I must be going now. The caretaker, Mr. Jenkins, lives in the cottage at the edge of the property. He tends to the grounds once a week. Otherwise, you'll have your privacy. Should you need anything, my contact information is in the documents. And with that, I was left alone in my new home, standing in the shadow of my great-aunt's portrait. That first night in Blackwood Manor was eerily quiet. I chose to sleep in what appeared to be the master bedroom, a large room with a four-poster bed and heavy velvet drapes. Sleep came surprisingly easily, perhaps due to the exhaustion of travel and the overwhelming nature of my new circumstances. I was awakened just before dawn by a thunderous crash. Bolting upright, I fumbled for the lamp on the bedside table. The sound had come from downstairs. I grabbed my phone as a makeshift flashlight and cautiously made my way through the dark hallways. The source of the noise became apparent as soon as I reached the main hall. The portrait of Evelyn Blackwood lay face down on the hardwood floor several feet away from the fireplace where it had been hanging. The heavy gilded frame had shattered in one corner. What the hell? I muttered, approaching the fallen painting. I knelt down to examine it, careful of the broken glass. The canvas appeared undamaged, those penetrating eyes still staring up at me accusingly, as if I had somehow failed in my duty already. The wall hook seemed intact, and the wire on the back of the frame was still securely fastened. There was no obvious reason why it should have fallen, especially with such force that it landed so far from the wall. Nevertheless, I carefully picked up the portrait and leaned it against the wall. I would need to repair the frame before hanging it again. One day in and I'd already broken my only promise to my benefactor. After a restless few hours, I drove into town at first light to find a hardware store. The small New England town of Ravenwood was exactly what you'd expect, quaint, historic, with locals who immediately recognized me as an outsider. At Harper's Hardware, I found what I needed to repair the frame along with a sturdier wall hook. "You must be the new owner of Blackwood Manor," said the elderly shopkeeper as he rang up my purchases. His name tag read Walter. "News travels fast," I replied with a small smile. "Small town," he shrugged. But there was something in his expression, concern, perhaps. "We don't get many newcomers, especially not ones moving into that old place." "Did you know my great-aunt?" I asked, suddenly curious. Walter's hands paused momentarily. Everyone knew of Miss Blackwood, but few knew her personally. She wasn't one for socializing. He handed me my bag. "You planning on staying long?" "It's my home now," I said, though the words felt strange on my tongue. "Well then, welcome to Ravenwood, Mr. Blackwood." James Blackwood. A flicker of something, recognition, worry, crossed his face. Indeed. A Blackwood back in Blackwood Manor. History has a way of circling back on itself, doesn't it? With that cryptic comment, he turned to help another customer, leaving me to wonder what exactly he meant. Back at the manor, I spent the afternoon exploring my new home more thoroughly. Most of the rooms were furnished but had clearly been in use for years. The library was particularly impressive, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, some appearing centuries old, many focused on local history, genealogy, and, curiously, folklore and the occult. As evening approached, I returned to the main hall with my supplies. I carefully repaired the frame of Evelyn's portrait, replacing the broken corner and the hanging wire with something much sturdier. Then, using the new heavy-duty hook, I rehung the portrait in its place of honor above the fireplace. "There," I said aloud to the empty room. "Back where you belong." I could have sworn the eyes in the portrait gleamed in the fading daylight, but I dismissed it as a trick of the light. That night, I opened the envelope Mr. Morton had given me. Inside was a letter written in an elegant, flowing script. "My dear grandnephew. If you are reading this, then I have passed from this world, and Blackwood Manor is now yours. You are the last of our line, though we have never met. Your father chose to distance himself from the family legacy, but blood will always call to blood. The Blackwood name carries both privilege and responsibility. This house has been our family's anchor for generations, and now it falls to you to maintain our legacy. The portrait above the fireplace is more than just a painting. It is a tether, a connection to all who came before. It must remain in its place of honor. There are things about our family you do not yet understand. Things your father chose to hide from you. In time, all will become clear. The library contains our history should you wish to learn more. Remember, in this house, nothing is ever truly forgotten, and no one is ever truly gone. Your great-aunt, Evelyn Blackwood. I read the letter several times, trying to decipher its cryptic message. What responsibility? What had my father been hiding? And what did she mean about the portrait being a tether? With more questions than answers, I finally went to bed, the letter tucked under my pillow. I was jolted awake by the same crashing sound as the night before. Checking my phone, I saw it was exactly 3:17 a.m. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my robe and rushed downstairs to the main hall. Just as before, the portrait lay face down on the floor, far from the wall. But this time, the distance was even greater, almost to the center of the room. The frame, which I had just repaired, was once again damaged, though in a different corner. Now, this is impossible, I muttered, examining the new wall hook. It was firmly embedded in the wall, undisturbed. The wire on the back of the frame was intact as well. There was absolutely no explanation for how the portrait could have fallen, or rather been thrown with such force. A chill ran down my spine as I recalled my great-aunt's words, the portrait is more than just a painting. It is a tether. I decided to leave the portrait leaning against the wall for the night and deal with it in the morning. But as I turned to go back upstairs, I noticed something I'd missed before. On the back of the canvas, barely visible in the dim light, was some kind of inscription. I used my phone's flashlight to get a better look. Written in what appeared to be faded ink were the words, "She watches. She waits. She remembers." Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The next morning, I drove back into town, this time seeking the local library. If I was going to understand what was happening, I needed to learn more about my family's history. The Ravenwood Historical Society and Library was housed in a charming colonial building on the town square. Inside, I was greeted by a librarian who introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Reed, the town's unofficial historian. A Blackwood? How fascinating, she exclaimed when I told her why I was there. Your family is practically Ravenwood royalty, or was at one time. That's actually why I'm here, I explained. I recently inherited Blackwood Manor, but I know very little about my family's history. I was hoping you might have some records I could look at. Of course. The Blackwood collection is one of our treasures. She led me to a separate room where several filing cabinets and bookshelves were dedicated to local family histories. Your family was among the founders of Ravenwood in the 1700s, quite prominent until the early 20th century when things began to change. Change how? I asked. Dr. Reed hesitated. There were rumors, of course. Small towns love their gossip, but the Blackwood family became increasingly reclusive after the incident in 1897. What incident? She pulled out a bound volume of old newspaper clippings. It might be better if you read about it yourself. These are copies of the Ravenwood Gazette from that period. I spent the next several hours poring over the Blackwood family history. The incident Dr. Reed referred to was the mysterious death of my great-great-grandfather, William Blackwood, and his wife, Catherine. According to the newspaper accounts, they were found dead in the main hall of Blackwood Manor with no apparent cause. The only witness was their 5-year-old daughter, Evelyn. The article quoted the child as saying, "The painting did it. The lady in the painting came out." Naturally, this was dismissed as the traumatized ramblings of a child who had discovered her parents' bodies. Further reading revealed that after the deaths, Evelyn was raised by her maternal aunt until she came of age and reclaimed Blackwood Manor. She never married and lived there alone until her death, over 90 years in that house. But what captured my attention most was a small article from 1920, when Evelyn would have been in her late 20s. It mentioned a renowned portrait artist being commissioned to paint her likeness, the very portrait that now refused to stay hung in my home. "Dr. Reed," I called, bringing over the article. "Do you know anything about this artist, Gabriel Montgomery?" She adjusted her glasses as she read. "Montgomery? Yes, he was quite famous in his day for his living portraits, as they were called. People said his subjects seemed to breathe on canvas. There were some rather macabre rumors about his methods, though nothing was ever proven." "What kind of rumors?" "The usual artistic eccentricities amplified by small-town gossip. Some said he mixed blood with his paints, or that he captured a piece of his subjects' souls." "Nonsense, of course." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Though it is curious that several of his subjects died shortly after their portraits were completed." "But Evelyn lived for decades after," I pointed out. "Indeed she did." Dr. Reed closed the book. "Perhaps she was the exception. Or perhaps she knew something others didn't." I left the library with photocopies of the most relevant articles and more questions than I'd arrived with. One thing was becoming clear: there was something unusual about that portrait, something that went beyond a simple family heirloom. Back at the manor, I found the portrait exactly where I'd left it, leaning against the wall. I studied it closely in the daylight. The craftsmanship was undeniably exceptional. The eyes really did seem to follow you, and there was a depth to them that was uncanny. The brush strokes were so fine that they were almost invisible, giving the skin a lifelike quality. Remembering my great-aunt's letter, I decided to spend the evening in the library, searching for any books that might shed light on my family's history or the strange occurrences with the portrait. After hours of searching, I found a small leather-bound journal hidden behind a row of larger books. It belonged to Evelyn, dated 1920, the year of the portrait's creation. I settled into an armchair and began to read. April 7, 1920. Montgomery arrived today to begin the portrait. Aunt Gertrude insists it is a rite of passage for a young woman of my station. Though I find the whole process tedious, there is something unsettling about the way he looks at me, as if he's trying to see beneath my skin. April 12, 1920. The sittings continue. Montgomery works in silence, mixing his paints with peculiar intensity. Today, he asked for a lock of my hair, claiming it would help him capture my essence. I refused, of course. He seemed displeased, but did not press the matter. April 18, 1920. I dreamt of my parents last night. They stood in the main hall, staring at an empty space on the wall, their expressions frozen in horror. When I awoke, I found a small cut on my fingertip, though I cannot recall injuring myself. Montgomery noticed it during today's sitting and insisted on using his own handkerchief to dab the blood. Something in his eyes made me shudder. April 25, 1920. The portrait is nearly complete. Montgomery says he has never created a work that so perfectly captures his subject. When I look at it, I see myself, yet not myself. There is something in the eyes that I do not recognize, something older, something waiting. I have decided that once Montgomery is paid and gone, the portrait shall be stored in the attic. I do not want those eyes watching me. May 3, 1920. It is done. Montgomery has left, but not before warning me never to remove the portrait from the house. It belongs here now, he said, as do you. I plan to ignore his dramatics and have Thomas take it to the attic tomorrow. May 4, 1920. Thomas found the portrait in the main hall this morning, hung above the fireplace. Though he swears he left it wrapped in the attic, I had him return it immediately. I want it out of my sight. May 5, 1920. Again, the portrait has found its way to the main hall. This time, I supervised as Thomas locked it in the storage room in the east wing. I have the only key. May 6, 1920. I cannot explain what is happening. The portrait was above the fireplace again this morning, though the storage room remained locked. When I tried to remove it, my hands shook so violently that I dropped it. The frame cracked, but the canvas remained unmarked. As I touched it, I felt a sharp pain in my finger, the same one that had bled during the sitting. A small drop of blood fell onto the canvas and seemed to disappear into the paint. I begin to understand what Montgomery has done. The portrait is not merely a likeness. It is a vessel, a tether, as grandmother would have said. I've read about such things in the family grimoire, but never thought to experience it firsthand. I cannot destroy it without consequences I am not prepared to face. For now, I will let it remain where it wishes to be. Perhaps in time I will learn to control it rather than being controlled. The journal entries continued, documenting Evelyn's growing understanding of the portrait's nature and her attempts to harness its power. According to her writings, the portrait had somehow bound itself to her and to Blackwood Manor. It was, as she described it, a doorway of sorts, though to what she never clearly stated. The final entry in the journal, dated decades later in 1967, was particularly disturbing. I have lived with her watching me for nearly 50 years now. We have reached an understanding, the portrait and I. It remains in its place of honor, and in return it protects the house and those within it. I have learned to use it to channel its power for my purposes. But I am growing old, and soon the responsibility will pass to another. There must always be a Blackwood in Blackwood Manor, and the portrait must always hang in the main hall. This is the covenant, the price we pay for what our ancestors gained. I have no children of my own, but there is a distant nephew who carries our blood. His son will be the one when the time comes. Until then, I will continue as guardian of the threshold. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. If I was interpreting correctly, Evelyn believed the portrait had some kind of supernatural power, that it was connected to her and to the house itself. And now that connection had passed to me. It was past midnight when I finished reading. Despite my better judgment, I decided to rehang the portrait. If what Evelyn wrote was true, the painting would end up there anyway. This time, I used heavy-duty mounting hardware that would normally support a television. Standing back, I addressed the painted figure directly. There. Are you satisfied now? The eyes stared back, impassive yet somehow mocking. I went to bed expecting to be awakened by the now familiar crash. But the night passed in silence. When I checked the main hall in the morning, the portrait remained exactly where I had hung it. For a moment, I felt relieved. Perhaps the sturdy hardware had solved the problem. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The expression in the portrait had changed. The severe line of the mouth had softened into what could almost be described as a smile. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over an ottoman. It was impossible. Paint doesn't change overnight. Yet, I was certain the expression in the portrait was different. Over the next few days, I threw myself into researching the history of the Blackwood family and the concept of living portraits. The family library proved to be an invaluable resource, containing books on subjects ranging from local history to arcane magical practices. I discovered that the Blackwoods had once been prominent practitioners of what they called threshold magic, rituals and spells focusing on boundaries, gateways, and transitions. According to one particularly ancient tome, they believed that certain objects could serve as anchors for spirits or as doorways between worlds. The more I read, the more I became convinced that the portrait was exactly that, a threshold of some kind, created by Montgomery using techniques he'd learned from who knows where, and tied to the Blackwood bloodline through Evelyn. Each night, I found myself standing before the portrait before bed, studying it for any changes. And each morning, I was certain the expression had shifted slightly, the tilt of the head, the curve of the lip, the intensity of the gaze. It was as if the painting was gradually coming to life. 1 week after rehanging the portrait, I invited Dr. Reed from the Historical Society to dinner. I needed an outside perspective, someone who knew the local history but wasn't directly involved. "This is quite an honor," she said as I gave her a tour of the manor. Few outsiders have been invited into Blackwood Manor since your great-aunt became its sole occupant. I'm hardly an outsider, I reminded her. I'm a Blackwood, apparently. Of course, she smiled. Though you didn't grow up with all this history around you. It must be overwhelming. When we reached the main hall, Dr. Reed immediately gravitated toward the portrait. So, this is the famous Evelyn Blackwood. Montgomery's work really was exceptional. Look at the depth in those eyes. Do you notice anything unusual about it? I asked carefully. She studied it closely. Well, it's remarkably well preserved for its age. The colors are still so vibrant. She leaned in. There's something almost modern about the technique, especially around the eyes. They seem to connect with the viewer. Have you ever heard of living portraits or threshold objects in your research? I asked, trying to sound casual. Dr. Reed's expression changed subtly. Those are rather specific terms, Mr. Blackwood. Not commonly found in historical texts. But you've heard of them. She hesitated. There are always rumors about old families, especially those with unusual histories. The Blackwoods were known for their interest in matters beyond the ordinary. But these are just local legends, of course. Of course, I agreed, but I could tell she knew more than she was saying. Over dinner, I gradually steered the conversation toward the incident of 1897, the mysterious deaths of my great-great-grandparents. The official record says it was heart failure, Dr. Reed explained, for both of them simultaneously. Quite the coincidence. And no one questioned this. It was a different time. The Blackwoods were influential, and certain irregularities might have been overlooked. She took a sip of wine. There was an inquest, but it was brief. The family physician signed the death certificates and that was that. And what about Evelyn's claim about the lady in the painting? Dr. Reed set down her glass. Mr. Blackwood, may I ask why you're so interested in this particular aspect of your family history? I decided to take a risk. Because I think there might be some truth to it. Not literally, perhaps, but something happened in this house, something connected to that portrait. The portrait wasn't painted until 1920, she pointed out. Evelyn's parents died in 1897. I know, but what if there was another portrait? One that was destroyed or hidden away. Dr. Reed was silent for a long moment. There is a gap in the historical record. Several Blackwood family items that should have been documented are missing from any inventory, including a portrait that supposedly hung in the main hall during the 1890s. Whose portrait? According to town records, it was of Eliza Blackwood, William's mother. She died under unusual circumstances as well. Dr. Reed leaned forward. Mr. Blackwood, I should tell you that I've always had a particular interest in your family's history. The patterns are intriguing. What patterns? Deaths in the main hall. Missing portraits. Children left to carry on the family name. It repeats, generation after generation. She glanced toward the doorway as if making sure we were alone. May I ask you something rather unusual? I nodded. Has the portrait moved? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? In my research, I've come across several references to Blackwood portraits that wouldn't stay where they were placed. It's a curious detail that repeats in the family lore. I felt a chill run down my spine. How do you know about that then? It has happened. It wasn't a question. Mr. Blackwood, I believe you should consider leaving this house, at least temporarily. There are cycles at work here that you may not fully understand. What do you know? I demanded, suddenly angry. This is my home now, my inheritance. I have a right to know what's happening. Dr. Reed sighed. The Blackwoods have always been guardians of something, though what exactly has been lost to history. The portraits, they're not just art. They're containers of a sort, vessels for, what? That I don't know. But I do know that every generation, a Blackwood is chosen to maintain the guardianship, and those who refuse or fail in that duty. She didn't finish the sentence. After Dr. Reed left, her warnings echoing in my mind, I returned to the main hall. The portrait seemed to watch me with new intensity, as if aware of our conversation. "What do you want from me?" I asked aloud, feeling foolish, yet compelled to address it directly. Naturally, there was no response. But as I turned to leave, the lights in the room flickered briefly, and I could have sworn I heard a whisper, so faint it might have been the wind through the old house. That night, I dreamt of the portrait. In the dream, I stood before it in the main hall. But instead of hanging on the wall, it was a doorway, a threshold to somewhere else. Through it, I could see a vast, dimly lit space, neither indoor nor outdoor, filled with shifting shadows. And standing in that doorway, looking back at me, was Evelyn Blackwood, not as the young woman in the portrait, but as an elderly lady, her eyes still sharp and penetrating. "It's time," she said in the dream. "The covenant must be renewed." I awoke with a start, my heart racing. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m., the exact time the portrait had fallen on previous nights. Without thinking, I rushed downstairs to the main hall. The portrait hung undisturbed on the wall, but something was different. The room felt charged, as if the air itself was electrified. And the portrait, the eyes were definitely following me now. No trick of the light or imagination. As I approached, I noticed a small dark stain on the hardwood floor directly beneath the portrait. Kneeling down, I touched it with my fingertip. It was wet. Paint? No, it was too thin, too dark. It looked like blood. I glanced up at the portrait and froze. A thin line of the same dark liquid was trailing down from the corner of the painted Evelyn's eye like a tear of blood. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. This was beyond any rational explanation. The portrait was bleeding. "What do you want?" I shouted at it. "What am I supposed to do?" The bleeding stopped as suddenly as it had started, the single trail of blood now dried on the painted cheek. But the eyes, they seemed more alive than ever, filled with an unspoken demand. I spent the rest of the night in the library, frantically searching through the Blackwood family books for any reference to bleeding portraits or the covenant mentioned in my dream. As dawn broke, I found what I was looking for in a hidden compartment of an old desk, a small, ancient-looking book bound in dark leather with no title on its spine. The book was written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be Latin, with diagrams and symbols I didn't recognize, but scattered throughout were references to the covenant, the threshold, and the guardian. One passage in particular caught my attention: the Blackwood covenant requires blood of the lineage to maintain the seal. When the guardian passes, another must take up the mantle. The threshold weakens with each generation, and only willing sacrifice can strengthen it. Should the seal break, that which waits beyond will enter our world, and all shall be consumed by the shadow. The implications were terrifying. If I was interpreting correctly, my family had been maintaining some kind of mystical barrier for generations, using blood rituals connected to the portraits. And now, as the last Blackwood, that responsibility had fallen to me. But what exactly was I supposed to be guarding against? What waited on the other side of this threshold? The next section of the book described a ritual that seemed to be the renewal of the covenant. It involved standing before the portrait at midnight on the full moon, offering blood freely given, and reciting an incantation that would bind the guardian to the threshold for another generation. The full moon was tonight. I spent the day in a state of agitation, torn between dismissing everything as elaborate superstition and preparing for the ritual. Eventually, pragmatism won out. If there was even a small chance that something supernatural was occurring, I couldn't risk ignoring it. As midnight approached, I stood before the portrait with the ancient book open in my hands. I'd gathered the required items: a silver bowl, a knife with a bone handle that I'd found in a locked cabinet in the library, and a candle made of black wax. I felt ridiculous, like an actor in a bad horror movie. But the memory of the bleeding portrait and the undeniable changes in its expression kept me from walking away. At exactly midnight, I lit the candle and began reading the Latin incantation. The words felt strange on my tongue, yet somehow familiar, as if part of me remembered them from long ago. As I spoke, the room grew colder, and the candle flame flickered despite the absence of any breeze. The eyes in the portrait seemed to brighten, focusing on me with terrifying intensity. The ritual called for blood, freely given by the guardian. With a deep breath, I picked up the bone-handled knife and made a small cut across my palm. I let the blood drip into the silver bowl, wincing at the sharp pain. "Blood of my blood," I recited, following the text. "I renew the covenant. I accept the guardianship. I seal the threshold." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the blood in the bowl began to move, swirling on its own, as if being stirred by an invisible finger. The portrait above the fireplace shuddered, and before my eyes, the painted figure of Evelyn changed. The severe expression softened, the rigid posture relaxed slightly, and the eyes, they blinked. I stumbled backward in shock. The portrait had actually moved. The blood in the bowl had formed a pattern, the same symbol that was etched into the back of the portrait. As I watched, it began to dry at an accelerated rate, darkening and crusting over in seconds rather than hours. The temperature in the room dropped further, my breath now visible in white puffs. The candle flame turned an unnatural blue, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then I heard it, a voice, soft but distinct, coming from the direction of the portrait. "The covenant is accepted. The guardian is bound. The threshold is sealed, for now." The candle extinguished itself, plunging the room into darkness. When I finally managed to turn on the lights, everything appeared normal. The portrait hung silently on the wall, showing no signs of movement or life. The blood in the bowl had completely dried into the strange symbol. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in the very foundations of the house, and I could feel it within myself, a connection, a tether, binding me to this place and to whatever lay beyond the threshold. In the weeks that followed, I delved deeper into the Blackwood family history and the nature of the covenant. According to the ancient texts, my ancestors had discovered something during the construction of the manor, a weak point between worlds, a place where the barrier between our reality and something else was thin. Rather than abandoning the site, they had chosen to build upon it, to become its guardians. The portraits served as focus points for the threshold, and the blood of the Blackwoods maintained the seal. Generation after generation had taken up the mantle, renewing the covenant and ensuring that whatever waited on the other side remained there. The portrait no longer fell from the wall. Instead, it changed subtly, day by day. Sometimes the expression was serene, other times watchful or concerned. I began to understand that it was responding to the strength of the threshold. When the barrier weakened, the portrait showed signs of distress. I established a routine, checking the portrait each morning and evening. On nights when the eyes seemed particularly alert, I would perform a smaller version of the ritual, offering a few drops of blood to strengthen the seal. Dr. Reed became a valuable ally in my research. Though initially skeptical of my experiences, she couldn't deny the historical patterns and eventually accepted that something extraordinary was at work in Blackwood Manor. "Your family has carried this burden for centuries," she told me one evening as we reviewed old town records. "It's remarkable that the knowledge was preserved for so long, passed down through generations." "Not perfectly preserved," I pointed out. "My father broke the chain when he left. He never told me anything about this." "Perhaps he was trying to protect you," she suggested. "Or perhaps he simply couldn't accept the responsibility." I often wondered about my father's choice to cut ties with his family legacy. Had he known about the covenant? Had he experienced the same phenomena with the portrait? Or had Evelyn shielded him from it, taking the full burden upon herself until she could find another Blackwood to continue the line? 6 months after inheriting Blackwood Manor, I've come to an uneasy peace with my role as guardian. The portrait hangs steadily now, watching over the main hall and, by extension, the threshold it represents. I've learned to read its moods, to sense when the barrier needs strengthening, and to perform the necessary rituals without hesitation. I've also begun to experience strange dreams, glimpses of what might lie beyond the threshold, a vast, shadowy realm populated by entities I can barely comprehend. They press against the barrier, testing its strength, seeking any weakness that might allow them passage into our world. In one particularly vivid dream, I stood before the portrait as it transformed into a doorway, just as in my earlier vision. But this time, Evelyn wasn't alone on the other side. Behind her were shadowy figures, countless generations of Blackwoods, all standing guard at the threshold. And they were beckoning to me, inviting me to join them. I woke from that dream with a newfound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about me or even about my immediate family. This was a legacy stretching back centuries, a responsibility passed from one generation to the next. I've since renovated parts of the manor, making it truly my home while preserving its historical character. I've become a part of the Ravenwood community, even joining the Historical Society's board at Dr. Reed's invitation. And every full moon, I stand before the portrait and renew the covenant, binding myself to the threshold and to the generations of guardians who came before me. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I think I hear whispers from the portrait, Evelyn's voice guiding me, sharing the knowledge she gained during her decades as guardian. The threshold must be maintained, she seems to say. The covenant must be honored. The Blackwood line must continue. That last part has led to some awkward dating situations. How exactly does one explain to a potential partner that you're mystically bound to an ancestral home and a possibly possessed portrait, tasked with preventing interdimensional entities from invading our world? Dr. Reed, Eleanor, as I now call her, has been surprisingly understanding about the whole situation. Our research partnership has gradually evolved into something more personal. Though we're taking things slowly, she's fascinated by the Blackwood legacy, even if she doesn't fully comprehend the supernatural aspects. Every family has its eccentricities, she said when I finally revealed the full truth to her. Yours just happens to involve mystical thresholds and bleeding portraits. The portrait seems to approve of her, which I take as a good sign. When Eleanor is in the house, the painted Evelyn's expression is invariably calm, almost benevolent. As for the portrait's habit of refusing to stay hung, that particular phenomenon hasn't recurred since I accepted the guardianship. It remains fixed in its place of honor above the fireplace, watching over the threshold and over me. I've come to understand that the portrait's behavior when I first arrived was Evelyn's way of getting my attention, of forcing me to confront the legacy I had inherited. The falling was a warning that the threshold was weakening without a guardian to maintain it. Now, as I write this account of my experiences, I sit in the main hall beneath the watchful eyes of my great-aunt's portrait. The eyes that once seemed cold and severe now appear wise and vigilant. We are partners in this ancient duty, this covenant that binds the Blackwood bloodline to the threshold between worlds. I often wonder what would have happened if I had ignored the signs. If I had refused the guardianship, would the threshold have failed? Would whatever waits on the other side have found its way into our world? These questions haunt me, but they also strengthen my resolve. For now, the portrait stays hung. The threshold remains sealed, and I continue to learn what it means to be a Blackwood in Blackwood Manor. The responsibility is immense, but so is the privilege of being part of something so much larger than myself, a chain of guardians stretching back through time, each doing their part to maintain the barrier between worlds. And if sometimes, in certain lights, I catch a glimpse of movement within the portrait, a subtle shift of expression, a blink that shouldn't be possible, well, that's just part of life in Blackwood Manor. My life now, and forever. The portrait hangs above the fireplace, exactly where it belongs. And I, James Blackwood, the last of my line and guardian of the threshold, stand watch beneath it, just as generations of Blackwoods have done before me, and as generations yet to come will do after I am gone. For in this house, nothing is ever truly forgotten, and no one is ever truly gone. The portrait remains. The threshold endures. And the covenant continues. Blood of my blood, guardian to guardian, until the end of time. And should you ever find yourself passing through the small New England town of Ravenwood, perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of Blackwood Manor on the hill, its windows glowing with warm light against the gathering darkness. Within those walls, the portrait of Evelyn Blackwood hangs above the fireplace in the main hall, her eyes watchful, her expression serene. For now, at least, the threshold is secure. But remember, as you pass by, some inheritances bring more than just wealth and property. Some legacies bind you to duties beyond understanding. And some portraits refuse to stay hung until you accept the responsibility that comes with them. This is my story. This is my inheritance. This is my covenant. The portrait hangs steady now, and I am where I belong.